Hey, I am Jeff Straw here at Pyramind, and welcome to another episode of Producing Out Loud. I'm joined today by two mentors from our mentorship network. I have here with me Will Marshall.
Hello.
Hello, hello. And Jor Vanderpoel, who is joining us from, where are you?
From Vancouver, all the way in Canada.
Lovely. Well, thanks for being here, man. You and...
thank you for inviting me.
You're so welcome. You and Chris Gear have had quite a few opportunities to work in the past, and Chris has kind of spearheaded our whole mentorship network over here, and you guys have done quite a few different things over the years, right?
That's right. Yeah, I actually met Chris over at ADSR, where I made tutorial videos, and then later we started our own company called Sound Freaks, which is where we make patches and do all sorts of crazy audio stuff.
Awesome. And Will, you've been teaching here at Pyramind for quite a few years
now, I think, on and off, maybe even 3. So it's been a while. Yeah, and the moment I take the DJ 210, which is kind of Ableton performance, and mixing, mastering, which are both, for the purposes of our topic, pretty technical. We'll get to that in a minute.
And you did our free DJ course, which didn't always used to be free. That's a wildly popular video here on YouTube.
That was...
You probably forgot about it. It was so long ago, right?
Yeah, I literally, every now and again, someone emails me and mentions it, but it's not in my head anymore. Yeah. It's just something that happened.
The beautiful thing about videos is they stick around. Well, so today's topic, thanks again for joining us, guys. Today's topic, we're going to talk about creativity and technical workflow, and really try to think of some ways and talk to you guys about how you stay creative amidst this sea of technology and amidst a sea of technology hurdles. And obviously a lot of the education bits and bops that are out there in internet land and also in production schools is very, very technically sort of driven. Yet we're making music, which is this creative expression. And so where do you find that balance? And then we just want to riff off that and kind of see where we go. So initial thoughts?
Yeah, well, this is for me something that I've been thinking about a lot for the last couple of years, particularly in the context of the campus, the ground courses here, because creativity, like creating music, is it's largely a creative kind of a non-rational, a non-logical process, and I think the majority of the skills in composition and songwriting are these non-linear things that are really difficult to pin down and difficult to talk about in words a lot of the time. And there's also, especially if you're doing computer music, there's this kind of backbone of technical skill that you just have to get things going. You know, you've probably heard before projects where people have great ideas and don't have the technical skill to put them together in a way that works. So I think we often, especially in education and especially in online education, end up talking a lot about the technical side of things because that's something we can speak to. It's something we can speak to kind of with authority. There are clear boundaries. We can shoot videos explaining things. It's just all very quantifiable.
Right. Which we do.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's important, but perhaps it's not the whole picture, and it's not even half the picture. I feel like it's a minority part of overall composition and songwriting.
But yet it's the hurdle you have to jump through to get to the sort of playing field, right?
Yeah.
To make two weird sports analogies at once there, but like really, without it, you're at a loss sitting in front of a DAW or in front of a computer to make music if you don't have that baseline level of technical ability.
Yeah, it's a phrase my father used to use all the time: "Is necessary but not sufficient." Which is
interesting. I like that.
Yeah.
Jor, what are your initial thoughts on this, bud?
Well, to me, the technical sort of aspect of it all has always been like very important to get my ideas down as well. Like, and with technical, I'm mostly thinking about just like really technical, like how computers work and how the plugins work, but also music theory, which is sort of in this same area of just like facts that you can know that will actually make it better. And the reason that I've always tried to sort of search for the technical side is simply to not get bored, to always get something new, but also because I noticed that with some things, like I know, Will, you do coding as well, And if you get into coding, then there's this very huge step suddenly that you have to take to be able to work on a level where you can actually do something. It has a very like sort of a steep learning curve, and I've noticed that is the same for a lot of technical things that are technical. It's either you understand it or you don't. There's no gradually going into it. And that step for me, every time you go from completely not understanding it to actually getting the thing, that gives this super rewarding feeling. It's a similar feeling as when you finish a song. So I'm very much focused to that because I want to get that sort of feeling, that feeling of reward that makes you feel good about something, makes you feel good that you learned something, and I want to use that energy to just make my music on a more basic level, or a more intuitive level, I should say.
Interesting. Do you find yourself spending a certain number of hours a day or maybe a week on kind of bettering your technical knowledge base and trying to dig deeper into that sort of world?
I definitely do it. And right now as well, like in the beginning, it's a little bit easy. Like when you're just starting out with music, it's a little bit easier because everything is sort of new. But after a certain while, you have to actually hunt for new stuff to learn. So not every YouTube video is going to be a hit anymore. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to actually get that information you're looking for. But I do separate the processes. I don't want to switch back and forth all the time, do something technical, try to get into a creative mindset. That for me doesn't work. So I do a full day of like technical stuff where I find like weird plugins, and I'm doing a lot with Super Collider and C Sound, just some weird crazy day of experimenting, generating lots of sounds. And then the next day will be the creative process where I actually use that to make my songs.
I like that.
Yeah, I feel that separation you kind of mentioned there, where you divide your time up into technical and creative activities or tasks is really, really important, because I find one of the things I struggle with personally is I work with a band a lot at the moment, and I'm kind of the designated technical person in that band. I solve everyone's problems. And that has, for me, been very difficult because it's hard for me to get into my own creative space, because I'll often be kind of called out of that into a problem-solving space. Mm-hmm. And the transition time between those two kind of mental states for me is actually quite slow. Like it takes half an hour, maybe even an hour to kind of shut one part of my brain down and boot the other up. So for me as well, like I'm doing a lot of very technical production work, particularly like doing weird stuff with Macs and things like that. And I have to do it as an entirely separate process and generate the output of that, whatever the output is, in something simple, whether it's just, blocks of audio or a plugin with a knob I can turn or something like that. And then transfer it over to a creative session where I no longer have to think about what it is I did. It's now just a piece of audio or just an effect or something like that.
One of the reasons why it's so tough to produce your own records sometimes, right? Because if you're in that space of, being a session player or some sort of an instrumentalist, and you've got to pull out of this groove brain into, oh shit, the plugin fried, right? What do we do now? Like you said, it's a significant amount of time, and that creative space for me is a fragile thing, and depending on which side of the board you're sitting on, working with other artists and producing other artists or engineering for other artists, like creating that safe space for them to keep that little bubble of creativity going is so important. So like, how do you facilitate that as a producer when you're working with another artist? And if you're only working with yourself, how do you facilitate like making sure to the best of your ability, you don't run into those snags and hurdles to allow you the freedom of just like, okay, I'm going to hop in and be creative today. It's not my like sound design tech day. We're just going to bust out a bunch of groove and track. It's a balance. Yeah. Right.
So I work closely with a guy called Andrew, and one of the things I really like about working with him is he has insanely good discipline around this. So he calls the whole kind of technical side of things teching. And if a teching problem comes up, say we're working on piano parts and something goes wrong with the piano plugin we're using, he will just instantly stop working on that thing and switch to something else that doesn't require any kind of technical input. Just switch to just using sine waves. Or so rather than trying to keep solving or working on a specific thing, if a technical issue comes up, just jumping out of it entirely and making a note that it needs to be dealt with later. And I think that works really well because it maintains the momentum and maintains that fluidity of creativity.
Yeah.
I like it. I think I wish to get at that point someday where you can just easily put that aside. But I do try to. What I notice that helps for me is if I actually block these hours or days in advance in my calendar, and then I can just take a look at my calendar and I see, all right, today I'm gonna do technical stuff, and I never doubt my calendar, even though I maybe made it the day before. If it's there, I sort of have to do it, and that really helps me. Just seeing it written down helps me to focus on that certain task.
I think like kind of big picture creativity wise, a lot of experts sort of say that scheduling downtime or scheduling non-scheduled time, so to speak, like white space in your calendar, kind of like what you're talking about. But instead of saying I'm going to be a technical guy, it's really free thinking kind of space. I guess it was Picasso that used to like stare at a blank wall and say he was painting already, even though all he was doing was just kind of getting his mind going. Do you find yourself doing any of that? Like maybe it's meditation for you, maybe it's the morning walk to clear the head, working out. Like I'm just curious, like outside of the studio, how do you facilitate creativity so that when you do come in, you've got fresh ideas?
I personally have to be very conscientious and careful around this because I find my creativity, this is true for a lot of people, but it's fragile and it is easily disrupted. And I think for me personally, the way in which it's disrupted is actually by accidentally finding myself off in technical land. So I have a bunch of rituals. I run in the morning now often, and I'll often have put together a playlist of kind of material that I'm interested in. So I'm kind of connecting to my body and shutting down a lot of the thoughts that are less than helpful. Mm-hmm. That helps a lot. I meditate periodically for similar reasons, just to kind of clear mental space out. And one thing I don't do consistently, but I should, is planning my day the night before. So that similar to what you were saying, where when I get up in the morning, I just do the thing that I know I need to do, rather than having that kind of open question of what is worth doing, like what is of value today, because it's actually almost a technical problem in a way.
Yeah, I have that. That's that last thing you mentioned. That's like that can be really killer for me as well. Because the problem, if I don't schedule, is that I'm working on something and my day is just looking empty in my calendar, and then that specific thing doesn't go so well. So I think, you know what, I might try playing piano, and then I do that for 10 minutes and that doesn't go so well. So you keep sort of switching tasks to sort of see what fits you for the day. And that, like, if it's sort of set on paper, then there's no question. But if it doesn't work that well, then I mean, I just need to try more instead of instantly switching to a new task. But so far, like this is all like talking about the how to balance the technical and the creative sides. But for my students, I also noticed that a lot of my students will actually wonder, like, if they even need the technical side at all. Like if it's not there, they're hoping they can skip it. Do you guys have like experience with that?
No, I think that, at least here on ground campus, especially the guys that show up, and maybe you can speak a little bit more to the online space, but the guys that show up are kind of already somewhat overachievers on the technical side. Maybe not every single student we get walking in here, but they really get how important that piece is. But all students are different, man. Without a doubt, I think that everybody thinks there's different inroads into this little game of ours. called this crazy music industry, right? And the one thing I always talk about in class is how there is no path, right? If it was an easy path to the career, we would just give you those 8 steps and you would go do those 8 steps and we would churn out a bunch of rock stars. It would be awesome. And it's so interesting to me to see everybody's different creative process, both in the studio and creating music, but also the creative process around like, how do I build my career and who am I as an artist? And like big picture wise, what does my brand mean to the world stage? Does it mean anything yet? And how do I get it to mean something on the San Francisco stage or the Vancouver stage, right? And then how do you kind of expand that? So like being creative with your career as well is such an important piece, I think, that I don't think a lot of people necessarily think of, especially when they're early on.
Yeah, there's something to be said as well. I think it's important to be able to be self-aware and honest about what your kind of strengths and weaknesses are. And I see on the ground campus, I'd say the majority of students I have are strong on the technical. And that usually comes kind of correlated with weaker on the creative. And then a minority of students are kind of stronger on the creative, and typically that's weaker on the technical. And I think that's usually about the way people spend their kind of teenage years. If people are getting into particularly electronic music from a kind of an I like computers perspective, they tend to be very technically minded. If they're getting into electronic music from an I like playing instruments and I want to record perspective, very different kind of skill set.
What about I like glow sticks and raves and loud music perspective? That's what happened. Wait, never mind. I've overshared again. That's what I'm good at that. It's a different mindset, right?
Yeah.
The cool thing is what we always tell people is find a partner and collaborate here. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. And no matter where you are, now it's so easy to collaborate online, is like the beautiful thing is watching 2 of those guys that each have different strengths pairing up, or maybe 3. And then watching what comes out of those partnerships and collaborations. And we're such huge proponents of that here at all the Pyramind sort of outlets of collaboration, because you're right, everybody's got different skill sets, and it's so cool to be able to watch that really help each other out instead of being like a hurdle.
Sometimes it feels like a battleground. Like when I work very closely with one guy I mentioned, and he and I come from almost diametrically opposed positions. And so a lot of the time it feels like a fight to the death over kind of whose opinion is going to win out. But the middle ground between our 2 perspectives is actually the place that we both want to be. Right. So, and that kind of energy is, I think, creative and constructive in its own way. You know, the kind of passion that gets fired out when someone else is messing with my kind of quote unquote song is useful.
There's something really scary that first time you let someone on your session, like you've been working on it, and you're like, okay, you're going to take a seat at the driver's seat and like take a pass at the driver's seat and like watch what they do. You're like, let's do a save as first, just in case you totally wreck things. But like trusting in the whole reason we're making music together is like, I've got some inherent trust in you, and hopefully you've got cool ideas that I didn't have already. Yeah. I mean, that's more collaboration than creativity. Sorry, I cut you off though, Yor. What were you going to say?
Well, that actually, it sort of falls along the same line, because that if you have that collaboration with somebody that's really from the creative sort of side and somebody from the really technical, like you don't often see them together like in the same person. It's often there's like a stronger balance on one side, but they do like just the core on the core level, they do complement each other really well. Like I noticed that if I learn something new, let's say I've learned about phase cancellation, now I can take that knowledge and take that to my creative world and say, all right, how am I going to use this thing that happens with audio if the waves are overlapping? How am I going to use this to create something radically new? So for me, the technical can also be like a source for more creativity, but I do have to separate it on different days, otherwise I get lost.
That's intriguing.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about identity there, which again has been something I've been thinking about, where we often identify as a creative person, or I identify as a non-technical or a technical person, and those kind of self-perceptions are really deeply rooted in us and kind of affect our own sense of what we are and aren't capable of. But something I really strongly believe is that people are not inherently anything in particular. You know, creativity is a skill that you develop, and people we see as kind of naturally creative usually just had the opportunity to develop that skill set when they were a kid for whatever reason. And so even if you come up and you see yourself as, say, creatively strong, but not having these technical skills, there's nothing inherent to you necessarily that prevents that. It's just a matter of time and learning. I think that's been something I've had to tell myself, because I've come from this very technical background, and I'm increasingly kind of leaning into improvisation and kind of jazz and experimental approaches to songwriting. And there's a little part of my brain that wants to believe that I am not inherently able to do that. And then there's another part of my brain that I think recognizes that it's a skill that can just be acquired by spending enough time on it.
And that's that fragile space I was talking about, right? Because your mind wants to play tricks on you when you're in that fragile space, whether it's in the studio or just writing on your own, especially when it's an instrument, but anywhere along the lines that little ring of self-doubt. It's this riff sounds just like the thing I did last week. Why am I even still doing this, right? And you got to push through that. And hopefully that something on the other side comes out that, oh, you know what, it's actually quite nice. Yeah.
Something that really comes to mind for me kind of on this point is I was reading an interview with Tom York, Radiohead, a couple of weeks ago. And for I think it was Kid A, he wrote the piano riff for Everything in Its Right Place, which you probably know, it's iconic. And at the time he wrote that, he did not know how to play piano. And it was literally the first thing he had written on piano. And it's actually a phenomenal piece of songwriting. Like, it's very, very solid. And so kind of looking at that, where the complete inability to actually play piano and the complete lack of understanding of how the piano worked was no obstacle to writing one of the better pieces of piano music I know. So it's kind of... It's proof that the absence of knowledge is not necessarily an obstacle to creativity, if you approach things correctly, I guess.
He's also got really good ears, right? It doesn't hurt.
No, practice.
That to me has happened. Like when I started out with music, that's also how it happened. And I noticed actually that now I do know the technical side. It becomes a little bit more difficult to do that thing where you can let everything go and you can just play. And I mean, now you're gonna see the notes for what they are. You're gonna know if you play a fifth or a seventh or anything like that. So that makes it more difficult. But I do believe, like, even though these things are like these are the super nice moments of music, right? You're just sitting down and you're not thinking about anything and you create a new piece. But I do feel pretty strongly that eventually, like, if you want to do something, you really need, or you're gonna want your background information just by looking at the history. For example, Beethoven, who's known to sort of has been at the start of the Romantic era. He was very refreshing at the time, but he could only do that by learning his whole life about classical music. And because he knew those sort of rules or guidelines, he could adapt them and take them into something new. So I do believe that it's important to get like the whole background picture, so you have a whole overview of what is there. So in this case, like the classical music, and then you can actually take elements and start changing them more consciously, and you can actually repeat that process. And the problem or the difficulty that I have with like just making a random piece without thinking about it is that sometimes I want to recreate something in that vibe and I have no idea how I did it. So that's where the the theory knowledge actually helps to sort of be able to continue that trick for the rest of your life.
I like that. It's kind of like having a vocabulary to speak from as an instrumentalist, right? That you're not, everything's borrowed on some level, right? Borrowed or inspired or straight up stolen. And there's only 12 notes, right? And without blues, there's no jazz and things like that, right? So there's like understanding the vocabulary that you're speaking and the language you're speaking then allows you the creativity to come up with new sentences. Yeah. For me, starting to play guitar a few years ago, being a saxophone player my whole life, like I cannot decouple the theory from my saxophone playing. Like I always know that's an F sharp. Like I can't not know that. And on guitar, I can figure out that that's an F sharp, but I don't inherently know it still. So there's still a little bit of freedom that lets me I'm just playing knowing that these patterns work, and I can decouple the theory, which is really interesting. It just makes for different songwriting. And it's not that my brain still doesn't understand why it sounds good, but it's not being forced into, oh, you have to play that F sharp there because that's the scale and that's what says has to be done. Like, I understand that from a theory perspective, but it does allow me a little bit of freedom. And I think that as you know, whether it's a new instrument or going into a new genre, you have to have some sort of an understanding of the language that I'm speaking if you're going to make a dubstep record or something like that, or a future-based record or something, like understanding enough to then push the bounds. And I think that's there's a case to be made there too. And it really speaks to like understanding the knowledge base that you're coming from, like what you were mentioning with Beethoven. It's a good example.
Yeah. Something, I forget what the quote is from, but a line I like, which is his theory is descriptive rather than prescriptive, in that, it doesn't really matter what your understanding of theory is. It's not going to tell you what to play next, but it does give you an understanding of what you are actually playing. So if I'm noodling around in kind of a blues style and I play a flat 5 or a sharp 4, I know what that is, and I have a sense of how that's typically used in that style of music and what its function is in other situations. And so it has familiarity to me, even though there's not a system that says, oh, you use the flat 5 here or something like that. There's also something to be said, I think, for not thinking at all and generating just a lot of material. Something I often do is when I start a track on the piano, I have no concept of what key that track is in. And eventually I'll find something I like. And then once I find that, I have to use my knowledge of theory to figure out, like, what have I actually done? What key am I in?
What have I done?
It's like that. Sometimes it's like, and sometimes it's, I was writing a track recently where I was, every second chord I was playing was not in the key I ended up deciding it was in, which you can do. Like, it's 2017. Like, keys is a very loose guideline these days. But, I was able to pick through what I'd done and figure out what it was in kind of a structural sense enough to then be able to change the turnaround and make these variations and modifications, or to pick a scale to improvise over to write a lead line, stuff like that. So I find that the knowledge of theory guides me into setting constraints within which I can then improvise further. Because, there are 12 notes, right? But if I can reduce it to 4 notes, then I've constrained myself in a way that's, I think, very creatively liberating. So.
Well, since we're talking about the technical or the knowledge side of it, I think, I really believe that there's this trend going around where some music making people will say, well, if I know too much about it, it becomes less of this mystery, beautiful thing. It sort of gets too technical and it reminds me of school too much. And I really, over my years of sort of making music with all sorts of instruments and plugins and whatever, I really noticed that it's music isn't really that fragile. It cannot break because you know more about, if you buy a very cheap guitar from China and you take a closer look at it, it might become uglier and you might not like it anymore. But music, the closer you look at it, the more beautiful it gets. The deeper you get, you see that everything is related. The mathematics, it just all checks out. So for me, that's the beauty about the technological or that area of it. It's that you get to learn even more about this thing. You get to appreciate it even more. That will be my final thoughts on this.
No, I love it. I thank you, William.
Something similar.
Can I call you William?
You can call me William.
That's
no one
weird.
ever does.
It feels really weird.
It's strange, isn't it? I know. The two things for me about this are kind of similar. Like, technical knowledge, from my perspective, is absolutely essential to being able to create good music. If you want to record well, you need to know how to do that. But that technical knowledge always has to serve a creative goal. I think sometimes we put the cart before the horse and kind of try and lean on our technical knowledge to guide our creative process. And I think if you can flip that relationship and make sure your creative process is always guiding your sense of what is technically required, because an infinite number of things to learn. So you're always focusing your effort on learning some piece of information or some technique or some skill that is directly applicable to something you want to achieve artistically. Then you can have a really healthy relationship with the tech side of things.
Yeah, I think that's my favorite, my favorite point really so far. And I think it's good that you mentioned it, because that's the problem that I had as soon as I learned some theory. Then I wanted to use those rules and then make music from it. But like you say, you should switch it around. You should make your music all on feel, emotion, and then if you can apply that other stuff, because the other way around can really mess with your brain if you're trying to do that and not really listen to the feel, but just go on like chord structure and all those things. That really doesn't tend to work for me, at least.
For me, and this is probably a fairly unpopular point of view, but it's kind of like understanding the technology that you're saddled with and not being force-fed updates that you may or may not get the most out of, or force-fed the brand new hot plugins, and really understanding like the power of the tool set that's in front of you and the money you've already spent to like acquire whatever gear you've got and using it to the fullest, to explore that creativity, as opposed to being caught up in the, I wish I had the frenzy that so many producers get caught up in, right? And yeah, it's inspiring to get a new synth or a new set of sounds or whatever that is, but at the same time, really being able to utilize the technology you have and understanding it through and through is so much more powerful than buying something brand new and then scratching the surface of it and thinking, oh, I've got the new hot thing. Wait, watch what I can do. As a guy that some fairly outdated technology in his studio, but it's like it's not necessarily a limiting factor for me. I come in here and I'm like, oh man, I need to update some shit. But it's about the creative process for me, very, very much so.
One of the examples I always use to that point is Burial's album. I think it's Untrue, is one of the best electronic albums ever done, and he used, I forget what it was, a basic wave editor, and he used cut, paste, Soundforge, yeah, and he used cut and paste and a time stretch function to do basically the entirety of the album. So it's the most primitive possible tools, produced one of the kind of iconic albums of the period. And I think that's an important takeaway, is sometimes you don't need much.
Yeah. Like the old days with a 4-track or an 8-track, like it was like in some ways a beautiful thing, right? Because you were limited and you had to be focused with your ideas and saying, look, man, I only got 2 tracks that I'm going to do all my drums onto, instead of 6,400 or whatever, like these unlimited track sessions that are great in a way, but also like almost too much. And sometimes that limiting yourself down, much like the vocabulary and the scale, like from a technology perspective, limiting yourself down a little bit can provide for some really kind of neat takeaways.
Yeah. It also can force you to like focus on the part that you should be focusing on. If you sit down at a piano, you can play notes. They sound like piano notes. You can change that later, but right now they sound like piano notes. And all you have control of is what notes you play when and how hard you play them. And that forces you to really focus on the actual part you're writing as a piece of music, rather than the part you're writing as a piece of sound design or, in any other sense. And I find that focusing in, like narrowing what you're able to work on down to something extremely specific, allows you to write really, really well thought through parts that can then be, translated back into whatever situation you need them for.
That's what I really like about piano composition as well, that you only have these like 2 things, which is sort of, well, maybe 3: timbre, pitch, and you have your timing. But there's not a lot of other things you can do. A few years ago, I tried to set myself the mission that I wanted to be able to take all my music, the songs that I make, and take out everything that is fancy, all the computer stuff, all the Foley, sound design, crackly, noisy, all that stuff, and just leave the melody. And I still wanted to be able to recognize that song. And I noticed that if I started doing that with my tracks at that time, that everything breaks. I mean, it just notices how little musical structure I had on the background. So now I try to start the other way. I want to make a song that is completely done in terms of melody, harmony, but sort of feels like a beginning, a middle, and then an end. And then I want to take that into the electronic world so that I know that the foundation is sort of there, and that for me has really improved my my songs personally.
Something that kind of comes from the live music world that I think really speaks to this is you have a song and then you have the arrangement and the orchestration of a song. And those two things are different. You know, the song is the melody and the chord progression and, you know, potentially lyrics, potentially structure. But you can have countless different versions of the song while it's still recognizably the same song. And I think, yeah, electronically, we often produce music that feels unique, but is actually, there's almost not a song there. There's just a collection of sound. And so if you rearrange or reorchestrate it, it is no longer the same thing. And that's cool to a point, but probably not going to get radio play. And I think for me personally, I've lost interest in that. If you can't cover it on a piano or a guitar in a way that is basic but recognizable, I don't think it's good anymore.
Good stuff.
Yeah, I had that a little bit too, but I'm trying to be careful with that point of view, because sometimes I make a section that's really cool, but it's really just one bass note for 16 bars. But generally I have that same thing where and then I also feel it. I feel that it needs a little bit more. It needs to harmonically move instead of having a reversed cymbal, stuff like that.
It's all about the riff. All right. With that, I think we closed. Yor, thank you so much for your time, man. Really happy you could join us for this. Again, both these fine gentlemen are available as mentors. I'm available as a mentor too. I'm doing some music business coaching here on the network. But it was, we've never really gotten a chance to talk much. So thanks again for joining us, and always good to see you, my friend. Until next time, out here on YouTube land, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for joining us.
Later.
All right. See you.
If you're a music producer, subscribe to our channel and stay up to date on the latest Pyramind tutorial videos, track breakdowns, elite sessions, and more. Visit us at pyramind.com.